We'll start with the lower receiver group. Inside the lower receiver group, we have our hammer, the inside portion of the bolt catch, bolt release that pivots on a pin, our mag well. Below the hammer, we also have other parts of the fire control group. We do not recommend or endorse people disassembling the lower receiver fire control group parts. Moving backward, inside the receiver extension or buffer tube is the buffer and spring. This can compress, and it is held in place by a small spring-loaded detent. If you need to remove this, you need to compress the buffer slightly, press down on the spring-loaded detent, which is located in the 6 o'clock position, and allow the buffer and spring to pass over the detent. Again, this is spring-loaded, so we want to make sure that we keep a proper grip on this to prevent the spring tension from firing this out. Sometimes it's detained, sometimes it can come loose. We want to make sure we're cautious with this. We can then simply pull with light force and remove the buffer and buffer spring. This is also referred to as a recoil spring. If we need to separate the two, simply grab the edge of the buffer and twist slightly, and the two will separate. If you purchased a Huldra Arms Mark IV upper, we may have questions about what type of buffer to use. The type of buffer indicated by weight is noted on the edge surface here. It'll either be blank, indicating it's a carbine weight buffer, or have a letter and a number such as H, H2, CAR, 9mm, whatever it may be. And those indicate different buffer weights, meaning that the weights that are inside of the buffer are a combination of tungsten or steel. The heavier buffers, more tungsten weights versus steel. And you can actually hear and feel the weights if you shake the buffer slightly. Once you have the buffer and recoil spring taken apart, you can simply wipe them down. We don't recommend lubing this. Just wipe it out, keep it clean and dry. To reattach, simply press the spring onto the lip of the buffer and compress and twist slightly. You'll hear and feel a click and the two will be attached. To reinstall your buffer and recoil spring or buffer spring, simply put the spring side into the receiver extension. You may feel some clicks and hear some clicks. That's normal, it's just the spring going over the detent. We're going to press all the way to the rear, compress it slightly and then release. The detent will now be holding the buffer and buffer spring or recoil spring in place. When we have our lower receiver assembly separated from the upper receiver, we want to make sure to never dry fire the trigger. By doing that, we would have to put the safety selector off of safe and into fire and press the trigger. If we did this, this would cause the hammer to come forward and have contact with the bolt catch, bolt release. This could potentially cause damage and we don't want to do that. While it is okay to dry fire a completely assembled rifle, we never want to dry fire the rifle in this separated configuration. One thing to note, that if the hammer is in the down position, meaning that the trigger was already pressed, the safety selector will not go into the safe position. In order for the safety selector to go into the safe position, the hammer must be in a cocked position. Now the safety selector can go freely into the safe position. Don't be alarmed if your rifle does not switch into safe, as you may just have to clear the action, which we'll cover in a little bit. A common accessory to install is a different buttstock. Now, we already went over how to adjust the buttstock. Removing the buttstock is very simple. On the lever, instead of compressing, we pull downward. Once we pull the lever downward, we can slide the stock off of the receiver extension. To install a new stock, such as this Magpul stock, which is available as an accessory at Mills Fleet Farm, we simply install it onto the receiver extension until we feel resistance. Then we pull down on the lever of that particular stock and we can install the buttstock over the receiver extension. We can now compress the lever and adjust it to the desired position. This covers authorized field stripping of the lower receiver, the separation from the lower receiver to the upper receiver, swapping out a stock, as well as removing the buffer and recoil spring. We do not authorize the user to disassemble the lower receiver, any of the fire control group parts any further. This work should only be performed by a competent qualified gunsmith or a certified armorer. Now let's talk about the upper receiver assembly. The upper receiver assembly consists of the complete upper receiver, the handguards or free float tube depending on the model, gas block with piston components, barrel, and flash hider. To field strip these components, we first pull rearward slightly on the charging handle. The charging handle has a detent located on the left side that needs to be pressed before the charging handle can move to the rear. Simply pulling on one side of the charging handle will not result in any movement, as this lever needs to be compressed. We can either use 2 fingers to do so, or with our left hand, we can make an L and pinch the side to move it to the rear. Pull the charging handle slightly, and you'll notice that the bolt carrier, which we'll go into more detail in just a moment, also comes to the rear. Simply reach and grab onto the bolt carrier, pulling it straight out and to the rear. Set this aside for just a moment. In order to remove the charging handle, we cannot simply pull straight to the rear. Doing so will feel resistance. We need to pull straight to the rear and then drop it down into the main portion of the upper receiver, and then we can extend it outward. You'll notice on the charging handle there are 2 areas of additional material. These additional material pieces prevent the charging handle simply from pulling out of the rear. If we look from the bottom of the upper receiver, looking in here, you'll see a cut that fits that additional material where we can slide the charging handle into place and back into its channel. Again, to remove, we'll just pull straight back until we feel resistance, drop it downward, and pull it out. To put it back in, it's just the opposite. We put it in, we align the area, and then we can install it back into its proper channel groove. Once we have this removed, we can just set this aside. There is no further disassembly of the upper receiver. We never take apart the forward assist, dust cover, or dust cover spring unless, again, that service is performed by a competent qualified gunsmith or certified armorer. We'll set this aside for a moment. We'll come back and discuss the piston components in just a second. This is the bolt carrier assembly. The bolt carrier assembly is a one-piece high-grade stainless steel part. The strike surface, as well as the entire carrier, are machined out of one piece of high-grade stainless steel. The bolt is spring-loaded. In order to disassemble the bolt carrier assembly, we first have to know the parts. So again, we have the bolt carrier, the bolt, which we'll get into further disassembly in a moment. On the top, we have the strike surface, which is machined into the carrier. We have the cam pin, and on the other side, we have the firing pin retaining pin. Inside is the actual firing pin. If you don't feel comfortable disassembling this, please, again, make sure that service is performed by someone who is competent and qualified too. The first thing we need to do is remove the firing pin retaining pin. Sometimes this is able to be accomplished by hand. Other times you may need a small tool just to be able to pull it out, slightly where you can grab it then with your fingers. Once you can grab it with your fingers, we can pull out the cotter pin, which again, this is called the firing pin retaining pin. Once the firing pin retaining pin is removed, we can tip the carrier rearward and tap on it, and the firing pin will fall out. Now it should be noted that this rifle is a little dirty as it's been shot, so that's why it didn't fall completely free. But this is the firing pin. Next, we're going to remove the cam pin. The cam pin is this square head pin right here. To remove that, we simply lift up and set that aside. Now, we can take the bolt and bolt spring forward out of the carrier. We'll set the carrier aside for just a moment. This is the bolt and bolt spring. The bolt spring simply goes on the bolt tail. This spring is designed for added operation in increasing forward pressure and also relieving stress on the cam pin. You'll notice compared to a direct impingement bolt, there are no gas rings in our bolt. Gas rings would normally be located on this groove right here. Because the Adams Arms Huldra Arms piston system does not require rings, it would just add further friction to the bolt that is not needed. So if you use any other bolt, which our system will accept any mil-spec style bolt, remove the gas rings if they are not removed already. With the bolt in this current state of disassembly, you can now clean it. Using a toothbrush or a gun brush, you can simply clean the exterior of the bolt. No further disassembly of the bolt is recommended or endorsed. One area also to clean is the extractor. The extractor is the claw located here. With a brush, we can simply get underneath the claw, or you can use a wooden toothpick or something similar. Directly opposite of the extractor is the ejector. This is a spring-loaded piece, and that is what actually ejects the empty rounds out of the firearm. This is the one-piece bolt carrier. You'll notice grooves on the side of the bolt carrier. These grooves match with the forward assist on the upper receiver. So when you press the forward assist, it actually engages these grooves, moving the carrier forward. The one-piece bolt carrier does not need to be disassembled any further, as there's no other parts that can be removed. You'll notice that our carriers have a nice dark finish due to the melanite finish that offers superior corrosion resistance as well as hardness. To reassemble the bolt carrier assembly, we're first going to take the bolt and bolt spring and insert it to the front of the bolt carrier. Now, this can spin freely. We want to make sure that the extractor, which is the claw-shaped piece, is on the right side. So if I was behind the rifle, on the Huldra Arms marked side, again, remember the right side of the rifle is determined as if we were holding the rifle and behind it. We want to make sure the extractor claw is on the right side, and the ejector, which is that spring-loaded pin on the bolt face, is on the left side. We then compress the bolt slightly to where we can insert the cam pin. Now, one thing to note, if you have the orientation of the bolt backwards, so for example, if we put the extractor on the left side and compressed, we would not be able to install the cam pin. If you come across this, do not force it, but simply recheck the orientation of the bolt, again making sure that the extractor claw is on the right side. We can now compress the bolt and install the cam pin. You'll note that the cam pin can spin as well. We need to make sure that the long edge is parallel with the edge of the carrier, as shown. We can now install the firing pin. The firing pin rides inside the bolt. To install the firing pin, we simply install it from the rear, allowing it to drop all the way forward, and then press it forward all the way until you feel and hear a click indicating it stopped. We can now install the firing pin retaining pin. This pin can be a little tricky to install at first. Once you get the hang of it, it actually goes in pretty simple. To install the firing pin retaining pin, we locate the large hole, which is on the left side, or the non-Huldra mark side, and we install the firing pin retaining pin. Then press it all the way through until the other side of the pin is starting to enter the hole on the other side of the carrier. Now we have the bolt carrier assembly reassembled.